And now please, Nina Emery.
Thanks everyone. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you so much to the organizers for putting together this event. I've really enjoyed the talks that I've been to so far. And it's very fun to be in Helsinki. All right, so philosophers, as you all may have noticed, have and probably always have been a contrary lot. We find consensus rarely. We're trained to find flaws in each other's views, to make objections to each other's arguments. But there are some points of consensus among philosophers working today. And one of them is that, in at least some sense, philosophy needs to respect science. Another way of saying that is that it is a widespread commitment of contemporary philosophers that we need to adhere to some version of naturalism. To be a naturalist, on my definition, is to take science as a paradigm of successful inquiry into what the world is like. What that means is that if we're naturalists when we're doing philosophy, then when we're considering philosophical theories about what the world is like, we should respect science. Now, I'll often slip back and forth between talking about metaphysics or talking more generally about philosophy. I just want to emphasize the way that things are stated on this slide. I think that everything that I'm going to say applies to any philosophical theories about what the world is like. So you'll notice that many philosophical theories, much philosophical theorizing about what the world is like happens in metaphysics classrooms or metaphysics seminars. It's done by people that write metaphysics on their CV as an area of specialization, but it also shows up all over philosophy. So everything that I'm going to say today applies to philosophers in general, insofar as they're putting forward theories about what the world is like. Now, one of the reasons I think we're able to achieve consensus on some version of naturalism is that naturalism is a very broad category of views. So there are many different ways of spelling out naturalism. In my recent work, I've been focused on a distinction in the aspect of science that we respect as naturalists. In particular, I've been focused on a distinction between naturalism as a view about the content of our best science. So you can think of that perhaps as all of the content that is written down in our science textbooks, the content that is taught in science classes, the theories that scientists arrive at and have achieved themselves consensus on. That's one type of naturalism that respects the content of our best scientific theories. On the other hand, you might have a methodological version of naturalism that respects not the content of the theories that are produced in science, but the process by which those theories are produced, the methodology that generates those theories. And in my recent work, I've argued that teasing apart these two types of naturalism and then also understanding the relationship between them, and in particular, the way that they're linked together, can teach us something really interesting and new about how we should approach theorizing about what the world is like as philosophers. So here is the plan for this talk. I'm first going to sort of spell out that distinction in two steps. I'll go through content naturalism as a particular version of naturalism, and why I think that the vast majority of us are committed to content naturalism already. I'll then spell out methodological naturalism, which is a view that I think is either less widely accepted than content naturalism or is less widely understood. So whether it's that philosophers don't believe themselves to be methodological naturalists or don't really understand the implications of that view, the implications are not currently effective in the field, and I'll spell that out in more detail. Third, I'm going to argue that content naturalism and methodological naturalism are linked. So you can't be a content naturalist unless you are also a methodological naturalist, or at least you shouldn't be. And then I'm going to talk about three distinct ways forward, three ways that you might respond to the link that I've pointed out. And what I'm going to argue is that on all of those ways, all three of those ways forward, we should think about the philosophical about our philosophical theorizing of what the world is like in a pretty different way than we currently do in the field. All right, first, content naturalism. Content naturalism is the view that philosophers ought not accept theories that conflict with the content of our best scientific theories. I'm going to say something about what counts as the content of our best scientific theories in just a second, so if you're worried about that, hang on. The argument for thinking that most of us are already committed to this view, there are two sort of different strategies of argument. So the first strategy is to think about views that historically were taken seriously by philosophers that are no longer engaged with at all. So here's Thales. Okay. He thought that everything was made of water. If this view comes up in the metaphysics class that you're teaching, if someone raises an objection to a view at the philosophy conference you're attending that says, well, maybe everything is made of water, as Thales suggested, none of us take that view seriously. Okay? That's not a view that is on the table currently in our field. Why not? The answer is obvious, right? So our best science tells us that not everything is made of water. Other examples include, apparently, Descartes thought that the Earth was a cooled star. We don't take that view seriously anymore as philosophers. Why not? Because it dramatically conflicts. It very obviously conflicts with our best astronomy and geology. Traditional Buddhists, at least in some schools, thought that the heart was the seat of consciousness. This is a view that's not discussed in philosophy any longer. It's not taken seriously. If it's proposed as an objection or a consideration, it's immediately dismissed, if it's even proposed at all. Why not? Because it straightforwardly conflicts with our best anatomy and neuroscience. So these historical debates demonstrate, first, that it is possible to have genuine conflicts between metaphysical theories and scientific theories. If, for instance, you had the view that there are two distinct domains. There is the metaphysical domain and the scientific domain. And when we put forward a metaphysical theory, we're only making claims about the metaphysical domain. And that is something that is to do something very different than to put forward a scientific theory, which involves a claim about the scientific domain. If you had that kind of view, then you should take Thales seriously, right? Because Thales was making a claim about the metaphysical domain, and the periodic table, presumably, is a claim about the scientific domain, right? So the point here is that you, just by looking at these historical debates that are in no way contentious, you can demonstrate that there are, at least in some cases, genuine conflicts between metaphysical theories, like the theory that everything is made of water, and scientific theories. It's possible that the content of our best science is sometimes unclear or controversial. Okay. I do some work in foundations of quantum theory. I think that is a perfect example where it is unclear what the content of our best science is. There is more than one interpretation that's available to us, and they disagree about foundational questions about what the world is like. Is the world deterministic or indeterministic, just as one example. Okay. But observing that there are areas of science where the content of our best science is unclear or controversial does not mean that content naturalism holds no sway or that we shouldn't endorse it. As these examples demonstrate, there are at least some cases where the content of our best science is entirely uncontroversial. For instance, it is part of the content of our best chemistry that not everything is made of water. And finally, I think these historical debates demonstrate that the vast majority of contemporary philosophers are content naturalists. So I don't think we need to take seriously the possibility that everything is made of water. Why not? Because of chemistry and their commitment to content naturalism. You can also demonstrate the commitment to content naturalism by looking at debates that are live in philosophy. So my favorite example of this comes from the philosophy of time. One disagreement that philosophers of time have is about the ontology of time, so which times exist. Presentists think that just the present exists. Eternalists think that the past, the present, and the future exist. It's widely acknowledged that presentism is at least in tension with, if not straightforwardly refuted by, the special theory of relativity, because the special theory of relativity says that whether or not two events are simultaneous depends on your reference frame, and there is no privileged reference frame. With a few short steps, you get from there to the view that what is present is relative to a reference frame, and there's no fact of the matter, therefore, about what's present. If you're a presentist, it then follows that there's no fact of the matter about what exists, and most philosophers are unwilling to accept that there's no fact of the matter about what exists. Now, this debate is one that is live, so I've written papers about it. Many other philosophers, contemporary philosophers, probably some in this room, have written papers about it. What that shows is not, the fact that this is a live debate doesn't show that content naturalism is an open question. I actually think that when you look more closely at the way that the debate plays out, you see everybody involved in the debate demonstrating a commitment to content naturalism. Nobody says, yes, there is a conflict between presentism and special relativity, and too bad for special relativity. I'm a presentist. The moves that presentists make are things like, it looks like there's a conflict between presentism and special relativity, but let me tell you more about what special relativity actually involves. In other words, they reinterpret the content of what we take to be our best scientific theory in a way that makes it compatible with their favored philosophical view. This is a case where it's not as open as foundations of quantum theory, but it's also not as decided, the content of the relevant scientific theory is not as decided as, say, the periodic table of elements. And that's why there's a possibility to have an open philosophical debate here. There's other examples, but I'll just focus on that one for right now. What I take these kinds, I'm sure folks have their own favorite examples, where there's a live philosophical view, there is potentially tension with science, and there's a debate that goes on about that. What I think that these kinds of cases demonstrate is that even though there's significant disagreement here about the content of our best scientific theories, the vast majority of philosophers are still all content naturalists. And you can see that because they don't just accept the conflicts and reject science. I want to highlight two non-standard approaches that you might take to content naturalism. So in the book that I wrote about this material, I had a chapter near the end where I considered the possibility of rejecting content naturalism. I thought that this was a little bit risque to even have that chapter in the book, but in presenting this work widely, I've been surprised at how often folks in the audience want to take seriously some non-standard approach to content naturalism. And so I want to just distinguish between two different things that you might have in mind. One is a straightforward rejection of content naturalism, which just says that the view is false. The other is a deflationary interpretation, which says that content naturalism is true, but either it has no significant implications, or those implications can never be discerned. So either the content of our best science is just too opaque to have any bearing whatsoever on philosophical debates, or it's in some way sort of incommensurate with respect to candidate philosophical positions. It doesn't bear on those positions at all. Okay? You might also, and I'll say something later about this, adopt content naturalism, but in a more limited form. Okay? I'll say something about that later, but for right now I just want to focus on these two ways in which you might take a non-standard approach to content naturalism. And I just want to point out to you all, far be it for me to say that you shouldn't take either of these non-standard approaches, but I want to point out to you all how radical either of these would be. So if you take either of these views and someone tells you that everything is made of water, you need to take them seriously. Okay? You need to take the view that everything is made of water seriously as a view about what the world is like. I think it's a rare philosopher who genuinely wants to do that, and therefore a rare philosopher who's going to take a non-standard approach to content naturalism. Okay, methodological naturalism. This is sort of the big division that I've drawn between different types of naturalism. This is a view that when you are choosing between candidate theories, philosophers should, whenever possible, use the same methodology that scientists use. Now, this view gives rise to two immediate worries. And depending on my audience, sometimes there's more focus on one or the other. The first immediate worry is that methodological naturalism just won't be impactful at all. And the second is that methodological naturalism makes metaphysics just way too hard. So on the first worry, this worry tends to come up for folks that haven't spent as much time in the sort of philosophy of science realm. And the worry is often generated in the following way. You think the methodology of science, that involves, labs, test tubes, it involves fancy telescopes, it involves the Large Hadron Collider, all these kinds of complex experimental setups. And what are those kinds of complex experimental setups ever going to tell us about live philosophical theories about what the world is like? Okay, so you're not going to use a telescope to figure out whether or not merely possible worlds exist. You're not going to use some kind of laboratory setup to figure out whether or not numbers are real. Things that are live philosophical debates about what the world is like just don't seem to be amenable to the kind of data that you collect in these situations. Now, I actually have views about the distinction between empirical evidence, i.e. the data that we collect in situations like this, and extra empirical evidence for theories. I think that that distinction is pretty blurry. I think that there are cases in philosophy where empirical evidence does have some bearing, but I'm just going to set all of that aside for right now, and I want to focus instead just on the point that this aspect of the methodology of science, the sort of complex experimental setup leading to the collection and analysis of data, that does not exhaust the methodology of science. It is a key component of the methodology of science, and it might be the first thing that comes to mind, but it is not exhaustive. In addition, there are various kinds of what I call extra empirical reasoning. So I'm not actually going to endorse any kind of simplicity principle here today, and I don't endorse it in the book, but by far the most obvious example that usually comes to mind for folks is Occam's razor. Right? So this is William of Occam on your left. Who said that you shouldn't multiply entities without necessity. A standard gloss on that is that you should adopt the simplest theory that's compatible with the data that you've collected. My favorite example of Occam's razor is from the outstanding movie Contact with Jodie Foster, if anybody's watched that, where she's getting, at the very end of the movie, Occam's razor makes an appearance. I won't recount it right now, but you should watch it if you haven't. Okay, so why I think that methodological naturalism will be impactful in philosophical debates? Because the data that scientists collect rarely uniquely determines a particular set of scientific commitments. Instead, scientists combine the data that they've collected with some extra empirical reasoning, some reasoning that goes beyond mere consistency with the data, and the extra empirical reasoning that plays a role in science is the kind that has the potential to also settle debates in metaphysics. In abstract, that's the argument for thinking that this is going to have some impact. One example of this is the principle of minimal divergence that was under discussion in the first talk today, but the example that I'm going to go through here is what I call the pattern explanation principle. This is supposed to just give you a taste of the kinds of moves that a methodological naturalist will make and the way in which they would impact philosophical debates. There's going to be, so the little argument that I'm going to give in the next couple of slides is there are many ways of objecting to it in the form that you're seeing it here, but I'm trying to give you a sense of the sort of maneuver that's going to happen if you're a methodological naturalist. Okay, so I argue, this is one of the case studies in the book and has shown up in a number of my other papers as well, that this principle, the pattern explanation principle, is a key component of scientific methodology. The pattern explanation principle says that well-established patterns cannot be left without an explanation, even if explaining those patterns involves the introduction of something weird or novel. So the argument for this having an impact in philosophy is going to come in two steps. So first, I need to establish that this is in fact a key component of scientific methodology, and this is going to proceed by pointing to cases. So one example, there are many more, is Pauli's positing of the neutrino in the 1930s. So Pauli is on the right in this picture. He's talking with Niels Bohr. When scientists first observed beta decay, which was one of the types of radioactive decay that they discovered in the early 20th century, they noticed an interesting pattern in the data that they'd collected, and the pattern involved a little bit of energy being lost during the decay. So the initial products, the total energy of the initial products was higher than the total energy of the final product after the decay. And at the time, scientists were very interested in this. There were several different explanations on offer. Eventually, it came down to really just two possible explanations. So one, which is the one that Niels Bohr was promoting at the time, was that the conservation of energy actually didn't hold universally, so it was sometimes violated, like the second law of thermodynamics, and this was one of the violations. What we were seeing in beta decay was one of the violations. Pauli, for principles that are kind of obscure if you read his writings, but very clear, he was very clear on the fact that he did not think the conservation of energy could be violated. So for him, this was a principle that had to hold, and therefore he needed an alternative explanation. The alternative explanation was that the observed final product of the decay was not all of the particles that had in fact been produced. So in addition to the particles that scientists were observing after the decay, there was also this particle, he called it a ghost particle, that scientists had not observed. And the idea was specifically designed to explain why scientists hadn't observed this particle, and that involved saying that the particle had no charge and that it was massless, which at the time was a very surprising thing to include in the physics of the day. So Pauli puts forward the idea that the pattern of energy loss in beta decay is due to the presence of this additional undetectable particle, the neutrino. For a while, no one really believes it. Then there is some additional evidence that's collected that effectively rules out Bohr's hypothesis. So I won't go into the details of that evidence, but it was widely acknowledged that it was no longer possible to explain the pattern of energy loss in beta decay by saying that the conservation of energy holds merely statistically. It's at that point that the rest of the physics community gets on board with Pauli's neutrino, and this is well before any kind of detection of the neutrino takes place, which is at least 20 years later in the 1950s. Okay, so what I take this example to demonstrate is that the pattern explanation principle is a key component of scientific methodology. The way that little case study plays out is exactly what you would expect if you thought that well-established patterns in the data can't be left without an explanation, even if explaining those patterns involves the introduction of something weird or novel. So Pauli was willing to introduce the neutrino because he thought otherwise there would be no explanation for the pattern of energy loss in beta decay. And once everybody else also agreed that that was the only explanation on offer, they were willing to endorse it as well, even though the neutrino was a weird and novel thing to include in their physics. Okay, and then this is the step that's going to be extra fast today. I have chapters on this in the book and also papers on this point. I think that we can then, once we have established as methodological naturalists that the pattern explanation principle is a key component of scientific methodology, you can then apply that to various philosophical debates. So one example where I have applied it is debates between governing and non-governing conceptions of laws. The idea is that laws don't just describe what happens in the world, but they determine or in some other way govern what happens in the world. Generally speaking, the view is that the governing conception of laws is a view on which laws play a robust explanatory role, and what you're giving up if you move away from the governing conception of laws is that explanatory role. The reason why folks are sometimes interested in a non-governing conception of laws is because they think that governing laws are weird or novel, and they don't want that kind of thing in their metaphysics. But if the pattern explanation principle is a key component of scientific methodology, and we're methodological naturalists, then that is an unreasonable position to take, to refuse to accept governing laws because they're weird or novel or in some other way sort of metaphysically suspect. Okay. I also have a similar view about the wave function, which I won't go into right now, but would be happy to talk about in Q&A or at lunch. To go back to those two immediate worries that I identified for methodological naturalism, I just talked about why methodological naturalism will be, in fact, impactful. The second immediate worry, which tends to be front of mind for philosophers of science, is that methodological naturalism might make philosophical theorizing about what the world is like just too hard. And this tends to come up if you've spent a lot of time thinking about extra empirical reasoning in science and the amount of disagreement there is about what extra empirical reasoning looks like, how context dependent it is, those kinds of concerns. In response to this worry, I'm only going to say that we never had any promises that metaphysics was going to be easy. All right, now I'm going to argue that there is a link, as I sort of I gestured to before, between these two types of naturalism. And in particular, I think that you cannot be a content naturalist unless you are also a methodological naturalist, or you cannot rationally be so. The argument, a brief version of the argument, is up on the slide. In the book, I go through this argument in pedantic detail, in premise conclusion form, in like 7 different ways. So in my experience, no one has been convinced by that really pedantic detail that isn't convinced by the paragraph that's up on the slide. So I'll just show you this. There's no reason to respect the content of our best scientific theories if we do not also respect the methodology that produces those theories. If you don't think that the methodology that produces scientific theories also tracks good metaphysical theories, then why would you care if your favored metaphysical theories conflict with your best scientific theories? So those scientific theories were produced by a methodology that, however excellent at producing good science, is not reliable when it comes to metaphysics. That's the idea. Now, I want to point out a couple different things about this argument. So the first is that this argument is, it works under a bunch of different understandings of what counts as a good metaphysical theory. So what I said in the argument was that if you don't think the methodology that produces science produces good metaphysical theories, then why would you care if there's a conflict between your best science and your favorite metaphysical theory? I didn't say anything about what counts as a good metaphysical theory. That's by design. So I'm just a boring realist. I think that good metaphysical theories are true metaphysical theories. Okay? But you may be you have some sort of sophisticated pragmatism in mind where you think good metaphysical theories are theories that are useful for creatures like us. Maybe you even have a view on which there are normative elements that go into determining what counts as a good metaphysical theory. Sorry, is that 20 including Q&A? Or, okay, thank you. On any of those views, the argument still works. Okay, so whatever you take to be the standards of good metaphysical theorizing, just slot that into the arguments in the relevant place, and the argument will still go through. The other thing I want to emphasize is that the argument will still work even if you think that scientific methodology is minimal, that it's non-exclusive, i.e. good scientific methodology is just good epistemological methodology in general or something like that. Even if you think that scientific methodology is context dependent, and even if you think that scientific methodology is difficult to discern, the argument will still go through. On these views, the impact of scientific methodology might be minimal, It might be non-exclusive, it might be context-dependent, it might be difficult to discern, but that won't undermine the link between content naturalism and methodological naturalism. And then finally, I want to emphasize that the argument establishes a conditional. So there's two big picture ways that you can respond to it. You can respond to it by accepting both content naturalism and methodological naturalism, or by rejecting both. Sometimes I hear worries about the argument that are really just reasons for going one way or the other. An example of this is folks who think that scientific methodology involves some kind of pragmatic or even pragmatic or normative or even political aspect, and don't want that to show up in their the methodology that they're applying to metaphysics. That's not an objection to the argument. That's just a reason for rejecting methodological naturalism, which the argument allows you to do as long as you also reject content naturalism. I've given some reasons earlier for thinking that's a pretty unattractive way to go, but it is available to you just in virtue of the argument that I've given here. And then finally, I just want to flag that everything that I'm going to say following this point is going to hold even if you only adopt a weak version of the link where content naturalism gives you defeasible reasons for being a methodological naturalist. I like the strong version, so I'm going to go with that. But it is possible to accept a weaker version of the link. All right, so now I'm going to talk about 3 different ways forward from here, quickly. And what I want to emphasize is that on any of these ways forward, you need to substantially engage with methodological naturalism and the examples, including the kinds of examples that I walked through earlier. So the first way, that point is going to be most obvious. This is the way that I personally think is most reasonable and that I personally subscribe to. This is to adopt content naturalism and methodological naturalism and to just go forth and engage in the hard work of figuring out what the extra empirical aspects of scientific methodology are and apply those to philosophical debates, as I demonstrated with the example about the pattern explanation principle and the metaphysics of laws. On this view, I want to emphasize that we should approach metaphysics and philosophical theorizing about what the world is like quite differently than we currently do in the field. And in particular, on this view, there's no prima facie reason to believe that there's going to be anything like a clean distinction between, on the one hand, naturalistic metaphysics, and on the other hand, a priori metaphysics. All metaphysics should be assumed to be naturalistic metaphysics until proven otherwise. Another way of saying that is that all metaphysics needs to engage with science, at least with respect to the methodology of science, even if it doesn't look like the content of science is going to have any bearing on the debate in question. A second big picture possible way forward is to adopt content naturalism and methodological naturalism, but take a substantive view about the methodology of science such that that methodology doesn't ever apply to philosophical debates. So I don't, as you can see with the little note at the bottom, I don't like this strategy. I don't think that there is a reasonable position here, but it does seem to be something that is attractive, especially among philosophers of science. One example that you might go forward with is you might think that there's some kind of distinction between scientific debates or philosophical debates, maybe with respect to the kind of empirical data that's collected in the latter, but not, or sorry, in the former, but not the latter, maybe with respect to the extent to which the debates are underdetermined. We can talk about these in the Q&A if anyone is interested. But if you have that, if you can draw that kind of distinction between scientific debates and philosophical debates, you could potentially say, I'm a content naturalist and a methodological naturalist, but the methodology of science is not going to impact any philosophical views. You could also get this off the ground by endorsing a really radical kind of context dependence, not a standard one, but a really radical kind of context dependence. The main thing I want to say about this option is just to point out that even if you go this way, you're not off the hook with respect to engaging with science as a metaphysician. You might not need to go through the process of identifying, as I did, the pattern explanation principle or the principle of minimal divergence or these other particular extra empirical principles, but only because you have taken on board a very substantive view about what the methodology of science consists in, that is, insulating your philosophical debates. And then the last option that I want to identify is just to adopt not a non-standard approach to content naturalism, as I talked about it earlier, but some kind of limited form of content naturalism. So this is one example. Defeasible content naturalism says that metaphysicians have very good but defeasible reason not to accept theories that conflict with the content of our best scientific theories. Okay. I'll give it another example in a second. The main thing that I'm going to say about any kind of limited version of content naturalism is that there is still going to be a link between that limited version of content naturalism and a limited version of methodological naturalism. So for instance, if you are a defeasible content naturalist, the argument that I gave earlier is also going to establish that you should be a defeasible methodological naturalist. You should think that we've got very good, though defeasible reason to, whenever possible, use the methodology that scientists use. Another example is if you think that we should be structural content naturalists, so we shouldn't put forward theories that conflict with the structural contents of our best scientific theories. Here I'm leaning on the notion of structure that comes out of the structural realism debate in philosophy of science. My point is just going to be that if you're a structural content naturalist, you also need to be a structural methodological naturalist, so we should use the methodology that scientists use to produce the structural content of our best scientific theories. Okay. So again, here, even if you are in some sense giving up content naturalism as I described it earlier, you still have to robustly engage with science when you're doing metaphysics, and in particular with the methodology of science when you're doing metaphysics. And I'll just close by saying that, again, as I said earlier, the first way, a wholehearted endorsement of content naturalism and methodological naturalism, is the way that I prefer. With respect to this idea of adopting a limited form of content naturalism, the concern is just going to be not that you can't refute the person who thinks that everything is made of water, but you do need to engage, because you need to figure out whether our best science is giving you the kinds of defeasible reasons for endorsing the periodic table, or whether the periodic table counts as capturing the relative structural content. In other words, you need to sort through the implications of our best science for whatever limited version of content naturalism you endorse. And again, this is a surprising view that you would have to engage if someone tells you everything is made of water. All right, thank you very much. So the slides are on my website if anybody wants to, if I said anything that went too fast and you want to pull it up and refer to them. And more about all of this is in my recent book. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes. We see how this goes. Keep your hands up, please. And you there to the right. Give you the first.
Who's going to catch it? Thanks for the talk. An important philosophical tool are thought experiments, and they are also heavily used in science. Especially according to Kuhn, before paradigm changes happen, so conceptual revolutions and so on. So my question is, how does content naturalism account for the use of thought experiments in science?
So are you worried that thought experiments will, sorry, can Mark keep the cube so I can ask him a question? Thank you. Are you worried that there is going to be a conflict? The thought experiment itself involves a conflict with our best science because you're imagining?
I'm just a bit worried that this is a philosophical tool, a tool that comes from metaphysics and so on, but something that scientists have to use from time to time at least. So it seems to me that that the relationship between scientific progress and conceptual progress in philosophy is a bit more two-sided. And thought experiments are perhaps a case in point.
Good. Okay, thanks. So methodological naturalism says that if you have the methodology, if the methodology of science has some bearing on your philosophical debate, then you need to take that seriously. You need to follow where that leads. It doesn't rule out the possibility of there being some additional methodology beyond the methodology of science that comes in when the methodology of science leaves some question open. Okay, so you might think that currently the methodology of science leaves open questions related to the foundations of quantum theory and therefore related to whether or not the world is indeterministic. That doesn't mean that philosophers can't take a stand on that question. It means that they don't have any reasons stemming from methodological naturalism to endorse one view or the other, but they might wheel in some additional methodology. So I think that what I want to say about thought experiments, I'm suspicious of whether that counts as like philosophical as opposed to scientific methodology, but even if I granted that, I would say that that's an additional piece of methodology that is relevant when the scientific methodology has been exhausted. Thanks.
Thank you. Welcome.
Cool, thank you. I have a question about the pattern recognition principle. So you recounted how Pauli explained energy loss and beta decay by introducing the neutrino. And Bohr wanted to say that this energy loss was due to some sort of violation of the principle of energy conservation. But I wonder if Bohr could have introduced something weird or novel to the law of energy conservation. Of course, Pauli's approach won out. But would you mind clarifying what sort of weird or novel something is an acceptable addition according to the pattern explanation principle?
Good. It's a good question. And I'm not going to go into why Bohr couldn't make that move because it involves going into the details of these experiments in 1933 by Chadwick, but we can talk about it afterwards if you want. But bigger picture point, so what kind of weirdness or novelty is allowed? I think when you look beyond, so the neutrino case is just one example. I think there's a lot of other ones. Ones that I've written about include the introduction of the electromagnetic field by Faraday, and this may be controversial given the first talk, but the introduction of dark energy in the early 2000s. And when you take all of those together, it really looks to me like there is no limit on how weird or novel an entity can be if you need it in order to explain some pattern in the data. So the dark energy case is a good example. So cosmologists have their favored view of dark energy, but most of them, if you ask, will admit that we do not know what dark energy is. And one of the options on the table is that it's a wholly sui generis thing. What is it? All that there is a widespread commitment to is that it is the thing that explains the accelerating rate of expansion of the universe. So basically it's just a placeholder, which means that for whatever's playing that explanatory role, which means that there are no limits whatsoever on what kind of entity it can end up being. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, Yanni, and you can pass the microphone on to the gentleman behind you then later.
Okay, thanks. It seems to me that perhaps content naturalism is a good idea for some topics and subfields of metaphysics, such as metaphysics of science and metaphysics of time, but then there are several central metaphysical topics where, at least for me, it's a bit hard to see how scientific methods could be even suitable, like problems of general metaphysics, what it is to be, whether being and existence is the same thing, then more kind of specific topics like metaphysics of modality, what is the correct notion of essence, for example, then metaphysics of ethics, whether there are moral properties or not, freedom of free will, what is freedom in metaphysical terms, Then, of course, some people still think that natural theology is a part of metaphysics, so whether there is God, for example. So it seems to me that there are so many questions and topics in metaphysics where the method seems to be something else than the scientific method, whatever that is. So that's my worry about content naturalism.
Okay, so thanks for asking this, because it gives me an opportunity to emphasize what I think the import of this argument is. So if you're just thinking about content naturalism, then everything that you said, I agree with. So there are a bunch of debates where it's obvious that the content of our best scientific theories has some bearing. I like to work on those debates. That's sort of like where I cut my teeth. Metaphysics of laws, philosophy of time, all the metaphysics of chance, all that kind of thing. Foundations of quantum theory. Obviously, there is bearing of science there. But then there is this whole other set of debates where science is just quiet. So like the special composition question maybe, modality, metaphysics of ethics. Those are all good examples. Okay. Once methodological naturalism is on the table, then I think that distinction breaks down, because the kinds of extra empirical principles that play a role in science are principles that could, in principle, have bearing on any metaphysical debate. So just take Occam's razor as an example, right? So choose the simplest theory that's compatible with the data. It seems to me like that's a decent candidate for telling us something about modal realism, or maybe about the existence of God. Right? So I haven't taken a stand on any of those kinds of things in the literature, but it is precisely that distinction between what I think of as naturalistic metaphysics and a priori metaphysics that breaks down once you adopt methodological naturalism, as I've argued you need to if you're a content naturalist. So my view is that the status quo in the field involves, it's unstable. So once you recognize the link, given that most of us are content naturalists, we need to think differently about that potential distinction. And I'll just say, I know some folks who are working on the pattern explanation principle, applying it in metaethics, just as a concrete example of that playing out. Not me, but others.
Thank you. Gentleman there. Yeah. And since we are running out of time, please keep your questions short, if possible. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I always thought that one of the main things from 20th century philosophy of science was that we should be methodological pluralists when it comes to science.
Yeah.
So if we should be methodological pluralists in science, then shouldn't we be methodological pluralists in philosophy as well? And even though you can go further than that and say that it's actually for the betterment of science that we're kind of radically kind of in tension with the kind of methods of science. So for instance, like Feyerabend, so we shouldn't even follow the methods of science for the betterment of science. So for instance, atoms were ground intuitions, non-Euclidean geometry was kind of radically against kind of the current paradigm. So shouldn't we even not be methodological pluralists, even to be kind of supportive of science?
Good. So it's entirely available to you to disagree with the kind of picture that I've given of the methodology of science, which I agree is a relatively simple picture. You collect some data, you apply some you rule out all the theories that conflict with the data, you apply some extra empirical principles, and one theory rises to the top. If you have a more sophisticated or complex view about scientific methodology, say where, there's more than one way of going about applying those extra empirical principles, or those extra empirical principles are context dependent in a certain kind of way, that's fine. You'll then need to import whatever that is, whatever your view is about the methodology of science, into the methodology of metaphysics and philosophy as well. So whatever kind of pluralism, as you know, I'm sure, given the question you asked, there's lots of different kinds of pluralism, right? Whatever kind of pluralism you have in mind, that's going to have to show up in metaphysics as well. And I'll stop there too, because I should be sure as well.
Okay. Please.
Thanks.
One more question at least, yeah.
Thank you for your talk. My question is something like this. It seems like when you put forward this view, there is no reason to do philosophy anymore, or in this case, metaphysics, because if we have science and we already have the institutions and we have the methodologies and we have the right theories, then why keep doing philosophy?
Good question. I completely think we should keep doing philosophy. So Why is that? I think there are all sorts of questions that scientists don't investigate. And those questions are important. They're questions about what the world is like that we should try to answer. Why don't scientists investigate those questions? That's an interesting question on its own. I think there's more than a little bit to do with the funding structure of science and how it plays out, and the emphasis on collecting certain kinds of empirical data, and thus the disregard for questions that don't seem amenable to that kind of data collection. But I don't think that that means they're not worthy questions of investigating, and we as philosophers should take them up.
Yes, and I hate to stop this excellent discussion, but we are running out of time, so I'm drawing the line now, and thank you so much for this talk. I urge you to come and talk to Nina in the polls and in the lunches to bring up your questions there. Yeah.